Well, good morning. I'm Denise Gibbs, and I'm so happy to be with you. I am, as you can see from the first slide, the director of the Alabama Scottish Rite Foundation Learning Centers. And I'm just really happy to share this information with you about the Alabama Administrative Code and how that administrative code in our state relates to what we should do for children with dyslexia in terms of screening them for dyslexia, in terms of setting goals for them, for their intervention, and then for progress monitoring them. So we're going to spend the next 90 minutes talking about those topics. And hopefully I will click the right mouse button. All right, so in the Alabama Administrative Code, which you see I've referenced here for you, what we have is we have a statement that says very succinctly, students will be screened for characteristics of dyslexia using screening instruments currently in place for use in public schools. And we're going to talk about the screening that we have set up in Alabama and how our administrative code dictates or advises schools to proceed with the screening and then on beyond that. And so when we're screening for dyslexia, the first thing we want to do is we want to think about that definition of dyslexia. Because notice it says, screen for characteristics of dyslexia. So in the definition, in our administrative code, we have the definition of dyslexia. So let's look at the definition of dyslexia. And this is the definition of dyslexia in the Alabama Administrative Code. As of October the 8th, 2015, when these amendments to the Alabama Administrative Code were unanimously adopted by our State Board of Education, we then had for the first time ever, legal definition of what dyslexia is in terms of Alabama. And so this is our definition, and there the AAC rule number is, and in the Alabama Dyslexia Resource Guide, which is online at the State Department of Education's website, you'll be able to download a complete copy of the Alabama Administrative Code. Now, just as I should probably back up just so that we're all speaking the same language. And what is the Administrative Code? It is a set of guidelines or policies that have to be followed by Alabama schools. It's that whenever there's a law or a regulation that impacts education, then the administrative code is revised, developed, added to, whatever, so that schools do the things that are in the law. In Alabama, we did not pass a dyslexia law when we came to the table in 2015 because it was explained to us that if we put things in the administrative code, it was better even in that perspective than having a law because we could control what went into the administrative code. So we went for administrative code amendments and we got the dyslexia amendments. So everything I'm talking about references back to those administrative code amendments for dyslexia. So it is a specific learning challenge. Now that's the one word that is different in our definition of dyslexia in Alabama than at the national level. And that is, in the national level, it'll call it a specific learning disability. You would not believe the amount of time we spent as a team working on these amendments hashing out this definition and that word challenge versus disability. And we went with the word challenge. And you might think for a second, why would we do that? What is the difference in calling it a disability and a challenge? Well, one thing, it's a lot more positive to say that it's a challenge than to say it's a disability. The other thing, if you say learning disability, you have now imparted a legal term that has federal special education ramifications, and it would be really easy to say that's how they define it. It can't happen in RTI, general education. It has to only apply to students who have that special ed eligibility already determined, and that is not how we wanted it. We wanted to help children who are struggling with the characteristics and challenges of dyslexia before they morph into a disability. Because if you help children with dyslexia, I am convinced, if you help them when they are young and they are just beginning to struggle and face their challenges, you can help those challenges go away. And you're never going to cure dyslexia, but you're going to fix it so that that child has strategies to effectively read, write, and spell. They will always read, write, and spell with some degree of difficulty. As a person with dyslexia, I can tell you, spelling will never be my strong suit. Never. I will never read fast. But I made it through school and have many college degrees and have in fact taught at a university and written books. So obviously my dyslexia challenges have been well remediated and I have well compensated. If we start early when it's a challenge, that's what can happen. If you wait till it's a disability, I don't think you have the same good outcomes. And so that's why we went with the word challenge, because we knew we were going to recommend that all of the services start in general education as part of the response to intervention, or RTI, framework that is in place in our state. So anyway, challenge, that is neurological in origin. The rest is just the straight definition of dyslexia from the International Dyslexia Association and the National Institutes of Child Health and Human Development. So characterized by difficulties with accurate and or fluent word recognition and by poor spelling and decoding abilities. So the things we're going to look at are accuracy, word recognition, spelling, and decoding. Those are going to be the skills that we are going to screen when we do our dyslexia screening, because that gives us the characteristics of dyslexia. Do you see how that's going to fit? All right. The definition goes on, of course, and says, these difficulties typically result from a deficit in the phonological component of language that is often unexpected in relation to other cognitive abilities and the provision of effective classroom instruction. Secondary consequences may include problems in reading comprehension and reduced reading experience that can impede growth of vocabulary and background knowledge. That's been the definition of dyslexia since the early 2000s. Okay, that's when that definition came out, except for the word challenge. Now, guys, with our screening, we elected in our state, as part of screening, not to look at phonological processing. And we did that very intentionally in our screening. When we get to the screening protocol, you'll see. So in our dyslexia resource guide, and I don't usually give page numbers because I don't want people to print this. When we developed this, we envisioned it to be sort of a living document that would be online, that would be fluid, and we would add things and all. And if you print one, then it becomes kind of static, sits on a shelf somewhere, and you may not even have the current version. So anyway, but it is on page 17 and 18. It's not a very long document. It's really not. But it's in section 4. We talk about screening. And for grades 1 through 12, we look at these 4 things. Passage reading accuracy, word reading efficiency, how well they can read just regular old words, and then how well they can sound out nonsense words, that's the phonemic decoding, and spelling. So we look at those 4 skills, and that's it. And it can be done very quickly, very quickly. I mean, this, when you use my favorite test, and in the Dyslexia Resource Guide, we have in an appendix that goes with section 4, we have examples of assessments, many of which are free, that you can just, print and use, some of which you have to purchase. They're published instruments. And so we've got lots of different tools for each skill, okay, and a how-to for each skill in the resource guide. Now, my favorite tools, I would use the test of word reading efficiency for word reading efficiency and phonemic decoding efficiency. It takes 1.5 minutes to give that test. Okay, I'm going to give you 90 seconds to read the word reading efficiency part and 90 seconds to read 45 and 45. I'm not even saying it right. 45 seconds for word reading efficiency, 45 seconds for phonemic decoding efficiency, and in 1.5 minutes, I've got those 2 knocked out. And it's a standardized test that I can give to 6-year-olds to 24-year-olds. So it covers the waterfront. You do have to buy it. Okay, and it's the Tower 2 is the current version. Now, for spelling, I would give the test of written spelling. It's in the 5th edition. It takes me less than 5 minutes to give that. And it's standardized, again, for 6-year-olds all the way up to in the 20s. And then passage reading, I've got a way for you to do that I explain in the resource guide. And what that does is, I like it, I love it, when we just pull passages from our text that we're asking children to read, because they need to read a passage that is from their grade level, okay? You may say, well, but they're in the 5th grade, but how do I know that that passage I pulled from our English book or our literature book or our science book is really written at a 5th grade level? And the answer is, we don't care. Because what we want to find out is how accurately you read the text you're expected to read in your school. So if your school system is using a text that is 5th grade is supposed to read at 7th grade, if your child can't read at that, they still are going to struggle. So it makes it really simple and clean and easy, because you're not going to have to make sure all your passages are the same and that Vestavia uses the same passages that Chilton County does, that Selma City uses. We don't have to do any of that. It's what do you ask your children to read? And if they're a 5th grade person, get 5th grade passages. Anyway, and I've got some tools I can share with you about that, and I do share them in the resource guide. I wrote the section on this part of the resource guide. All right, and then we have a kindergarten way of doing it. I'm not going to talk a lot about kindergarten. It's basically dibbles, and you can see that. We set it up to be screening with dibbles, and because we knew that's what we were going to be giving kids anyway, and we can look at the dibbles results and we can see a pattern of weaknesses emerge, and we can say, you have failed the dyslexia screening for kindergarten. And that's easy breezy. Okay?
Can I talk about the nonsense word?
Sure.
We have been using the dibbles, not where they're reading and the sounds, but like sometimes if you look at like the C-type or something, that's more like listening, but it is asking them to read or use the sounds first, right?
Okay, are you talking about kindergarten now, or are we talking about here? Kindergarten.
We had a conversation about that.
And that's a really good point, because I do think you're looking at a totally different skill when you're talking about the C-top and what we're doing there. And so we intended this to be dibbles. And so I don't know that the other's not wonderful, but we didn't, when we were designing this is what our team was trying to come up with. And I have worked all of my life trying to get services for children in public schools in our state and across the country even. But guys, if we put together something that is so complicated that it's impossible, then you know what will happen? It just won't get done. So everything I've tried to focus us toward is simple, simple, simple. Because this is not a dyslexia evaluation. You're not going to say to a parent, and I think I say that maybe on some slide that's coming up, you're not going to tell a parent your child has dyslexia because they failed the dyslexia screening. All you're going to say is, hey, we figured out this child could benefit from this kind of help. And that's all we have to do with screening for RTI, is you're just trying to get a little bit more information to figure out, would you benefit from our multisensory dyslexia-specific intervention? And we define dyslexia-specific intervention, by the way, in the administrative code, and that could be a whole nother session. But so what is a dyslexia-specific intervention? And I'll just tell you that corrective reading is not one. And just throw that out. I don't think anybody's even using it much anymore. But there are lots of interventions that have been created, and they're not all created equal. And some don't have the characteristics and don't fit the descriptors that we have put in our administrative code, which is our law for dyslexia. So you want to be sure that you have picked an intervention that matches up. But anyway, yeah.
One question. Going back to that previous slide with the grade level text, should that be timed?
Yes, I'm sorry. It should be 1 minute. I'll let you read this passage. And what I'm really going to do is I'm going to take you out to Intervention Central, which is a free website, and you're going to go out to it, and you're going to go to the Fluency Passage Generator, which is on the right side of the screen, and you're going to click that, and then you're going to paste your text. You're going to have copied and pasted your text into that, and it is going to make it look like a Dibbles passage. It's going to count all the words on every line, and it's going to give you those numbers at the end. It's going to give the child a clean copy to read. You can make the font any size you want, any way you want it to look, and then you're going to have a score sheet. And it's going to take your text, and it will give you the grade level difficulty, and it'll give you the Lexile level and all kind of stuff about that text that you just pasted into it, and it's absolutely free. So it's called Intervention Central is the name of the website. And you look on the right side of the screen when you're at the home page, and you'll see Fluency Passage Generator. And it is a cool website for creating passages to use with this. And yes, you let them read for 1 minute.
Gibbs also has those passages.
Oh yeah, Dibbles has it, AimsWeb has it. There's lots of them. But what you're going to find is it works great for your elementary grades, but when you're looking for something for your 9th graders or your 8th graders, because see, it doesn't say we're going to screen for dyslexia in the elementary grades, does it? A lot of states that have dyslexia amendments and rules and laws say we're going to do this only through 2nd grade, like Tennessee, for example. We don't say that. So we weren't willing to just cast out those kids that happened to have made it to middle school before our stuff came into being. We said, we need to recognize them and try to help them too. So we screen everybody every year. Doesn't say one time in your life, does it? So they get screened. And so that's what schools are supposed to do. Now, when I make the point, you can get them to read 3 different passages, okay? And then you can take not the slowest, not the fewest words that they did, not the most words they did, but the median passage, okay? You can do it that way. And that's fine. Dibbles would say you get better data if you do it that way. I would say it takes 3 times as long, and if you've got a child who's really struggling, don't torture them that way, and don't torture yourself. Because honestly, this is my own personal thought of this. I'm not doing this like we did mostly with Dibbles, where we were worried about how many words per minute you could read. Notice it's accuracy. So how accurately are you reading it? So if I give a child a passage and he reads it with 60% accuracy, anything less than 92 to 95%, you're in the danger zone. And this is all in the resource guide, y'all, and has been for 3 years.
If we haven't been timing because we've been focusing on accuracy,
yeah,
is that a big problem?
I would just start doing it. I would just start doing it because, for several reasons. Number one, I don't want the screening to take very long. And if you don't give yourself a time limit, like you give the child a passage and it's that long, and it takes them 5 minutes to read it, you're dead in the water. So I would rather say to the child, I'm going to let you read for just a minute, and I'm going to tell you when to stop, okay? And so I want you to just read this passage for me. And I'll just have them do that.
Family get 10 words read.
We're out of there. Yep. And that's important, too, because obviously if I've got a child who's reading at a very reduced rate, plus crummy accuracy, that's a double whammy. But the accuracy is much more telling than the rate is. Because with dyslexia, and when we're, it's not as important, this is going to sound kind of like, she didn't make good sense there. That whole rate thing maybe can play into our identifying and the screening kind of stuff. But when you're monitoring for progress, do not let rate be what you look at, because the child can be getting way better and way better reading and way better accuracy, but they don't read fast. Because if you progress monitor Denise Gibbs with a rate passage, you would think I'm still very dyslexic. Like that guy at the University of Alabama who told me I shouldn't be in the doctoral program because I couldn't read fast enough. So anyway, we got to be friends later though. So if the team, any person on the team even, teacher, parent, anybody believes this child might have a learning disability, then you do not have to do RTI first. Do you hear me say that? You do not have to do RTI first. You do have to consider the request, and as you move forward with it, which will take a while, as we know, then you start doing RTI and you start providing the intervention and you're collecting that data because when you get to the place where you say, ta-da, they're eligible or they're not eligible as an SLD student, you have to know, one of the boxes you got to check is, have they had intervention and did that intervention not be successful? So you have to know that. So you can't just say like, okay, we'll just go straight to special ed, skip RTI. I'm not saying that, but I'm saying they can be done simultaneously. Okay, now, screening does not result in a diagnosis of dyslexia. It really doesn't. And we don't want to make anybody think that it does. There's a difference. The difference is easy and small. It's that phonological piece that's different and small. Because then we've now matched up to the definition, do you see? All we're doing in our screening is looking for the characteristics, not the underlying cause, which is the phonological piece. So, anyway, when a student fails a dyslexia screening, we have not diagnosed them, we've not identified them, so don't get anxious. Everybody can do this, and so the screening results, only thing they indicate is that this child is likely to benefit from dyslexia services. That's all. So in RTI, it sort of says, hey, do it this way. They'll probably benefit because their characteristics look like they shape up to this. Points us in a good direction for RTI is the idea. If the student does not make expected gains through the dyslexia services, then more intensive and individualized services may be needed, and so a referral to special ed eligibility determination might be in order. If the eligibility, through that eligibility determination, if the child does result in, okay, I better just read it because I'm stumbling. Through the eligibility determination process, additional evaluation may result in identification of dyslexia as the underlying cause of an identified specific learning disability. That part right there, identifying dyslexia as underlying cause, is not something we have consistently been doing across our state as part of our LD evaluations, and we need to start doing it. And here's that thing I told y'all about yesterday, that OSER's Dear Colleague letter, and you have it in your Google Drive. Okay. And this is the famous Dear Colleague letter, and I'm not going to bother to read it to you, but the one I've given you is my personal copy of it, which I happen to have highlighted when I first got it. And I haven't bothered to take the highlighting off, but that didn't come from the government, the highlighting. That's just from Denise. And it's because it's really long, and as a dyslexic person, I don't want to have to try to find what I was looking for. So I just use highlighting a lot even now in my life. And so there it tells you just what I said, which is if a child is identified as having a specific learning disability, the team needs to be willing and should have determined if dyslexia is the underlying cause. Okay? And then they need to necessarily, if it is the underlying cause, then the IEP should then necessarily reflect dyslexia-specific things because they are unique to children with dyslexia. And I thought, man, to put that the instruction for children with dyslexia is unique was, to me, like when I saw that, I just thought, the heavens opened up from Washington and just poured right down on us. So that is the Dear Colleague or dyslexia guidance document. And Dear Colleague letters, if you're in special ed, you know about Dear Colleague letters because we get them all the time. Okay, now, analyzing the screening data. We got, as a district, to have some consistent criteria to determine if the student has passed or failed the dyslexia screening. In the resource guide, we put that there are 4 components and that they need to have, or there's 4 components, and they need to be weak on 3 of those components. They need to be in the, and I'm going to show you on the form in a second. And so I've got some of the forms that we created and put in the resource guide, and I'm going to open this. You have all this in the Google Drive, and I want you to look at this form with me for a second. Okay. Oh, the gray's not showing up very well on the screen. It's gray over there. These two boxes right here are gray, and this is white. Okay? And so the rule is, when you're trying to figure out, and I think I've got it right down here for you on the form, if the student's scores are in or below the moderate risk or high risk or frustration level, so if we're in this area, if we're there on 3 of the 4 indicators, then the PST should consider that this child has failed the dyslexia screening and should proceed accordingly. Okay? So that guidance is there on the form, and I hope you're using these forms in your district to have consistency. I see some nods. That's great. Okay, so that's that. Now, then the way we also created this form is down here at the bottom of the form. So you got the scores up there at the top, and then down there at the bottom, you've got sort of like the dyslexia plan, if you will, because here it tells that they're going to get, what dyslexia-specific intervention then are they going to get? SPIRE, level 1 is the level that the child might start in based on your data. And then what's the schedule? Monday through Friday, 8 to 9. And then what is the maximum group size? 5. So you see, that gives you the fidelity piece of how you're going to serve the child. So that's your dyslexia plan on one line. Because, see, I like to be a minimalist. I don't want to have 15 pieces of paper to do the same thing I could do on one line, on one form. So here's the screening results, here's the guidance to the RTIT, the PST, and here's the plan itself, and then here's the accommodations and other services that are included. Because in our dyslexia amendments, we describe what a dyslexia plan is in the amendments, not just in the guide, not in the resource guide, but in the amendments themselves. And we say accommodate that children who fail the dyslexia screening should, with a recommendation of their PST, receive dyslexia-specific intervention, accommodations, assistive technology, and classroom supports. So those are the 4 things that are part of the dyslexia plan, And they're down here. So here's the intervention, the accommodations, the assistive technology, and the classroom strategies. And I've just given you an example. This wasn't a real life child. This is just one I made for demonstration purposes. So you see how that works. And here's a second one with a little bit older child. And I'm sad that it looks so nice and gray on this screen. But again, it's these middle, this column and that column. So you have to be over here in low risk to be okay. So don't start thinking, oh, it's got to be over here in the high risk. It's any of those 8 boxes. So you get 3 in the 8 boxes, and you're on your way to help. Does that make sense? Yes.
How do you feel about people using their professional judgment if a child is like at the 25th in one and okay in another, and then the other 2 are high risk or moderate? Like, so it's like they have 2 areas, and one of them is really close and they're really struggling.
I would say unequivocally, I always prefer that we give the child the benefit of the doubt and the help in case they don't need it. Because here's the deal. You put the child in dyslexia intervention and they start to soar, and you see, well, that was a bad call. Well, that child didn't need that intervention. Are you going to keep them in there for life? Of course not. But if you put them in there and you say, well, this is making a big difference, now they're not struggling, you're going to say, I made the best call possible. So I think we should all err on the side of put the child in it if it's a close call, because it's easier to fix things early than to say, just wait. Next year he'll be struggling mightily, and then we won't have a question. Y'all, literally, many, many years ago, I have a niece, okay, and she is now a wonderful engineer, and she's just fantastic, and she is profoundly dyslexic. It really runs in our family, and her name is Molly. And when Molly was in 2nd grade, she was struggling. Her mom went to the school to ask for help. Of course, I'm her little advocate, and I'm say, Jane, when you get there, here's what you say. So she goes, she calls me back. She says, none of that worked, Denise, not one thing. This is what they said. They said, well, that they tested Molly, and she's not going to get any help. They're not going to do anything. But in a year, she'll be retarded, and then they'll be able to help her. And I said, what? They didn't tell you that. What they told her was she wasn't eligible. She said, yeah, she missed the cutoff by 2 points. She missed the cutoff by 2 points. And so, y'all, that's what we used to do. I mean, we did used to do that. And it's sad, isn't it? Think how many kids we could have helped better if we could have helped them sooner. And so anyway, but now, guys, let me be clear. My doctorate is in special education, and I understand special education eligibility, and you can't mess with that because that's federal. And you start putting people in special ed just willy-nilly, we're talking about RTI here now, and giving them benefit of the doubt in RTI. I don't have a lot of benefit of the doubt when we're talking about special ed eligibility. So make it clear that when I answered your question, I'm thinking we're talking RTI, get services because of dyslexia screening, not special ed eligibility. There is no wiggle room there, because you now are getting into big trouble. They'll come pull your money, and we don't want that, do we?
Everybody that fails the screening gets that claim.
No. Let me be clear about that, too.
Okay.
If you fail the screening, what the amendments say, the PST must consider the services that the child needs. We never would, in a document anywhere, say that a score or anything dictates practice unequivocally, because then we're back to the discrepancy model. Do you see what I'm saying? And I don't think that would be right. So we put it in the hands of the team to make the judgment call. And that's how, because it is in the hands of the team, they are not bound to say, we can't put them in unless they got below this score on 3 of the 4 and they're only below on 2, because it's the team that decides. And then that's what we intentionally wrote into the amendments, because we wanted the team to decide, not the scores to decide. Because when scores decide, it goofs up. Because what if the kid's having a really bad day? You know, or a really good day, and they don't act that way in the classroom. Yes.
Okay, do you have any advice or thoughts on a child who, when you do dyslexia screeners in those areas, the tower and the TWS, they score fine. They score in the hundreds, you know, they're low risk, but parents have great concerns. They struggle in comprehension, and parents are insistent that it's dyslexia.
And it depends on the age of the child. So if the child is like a high school student, They might do better with the accuracy and all that jazz, but then have the comprehension issues because they are really having, they're having more difficulty.
How about?
That's one of the reasons, though, that I really,
Mid to upper elementary.
okay.
What else can you look at?
To me, when it's comprehension is the issue, and it's not fluency, it's not accuracy, and it's not phonemic decoding and all that, and it's not spelling. If spelling is good, all right. I hate that when I say these unequivocals, because then somebody's going to be like, what about so-and-so? But 90-some% of the time, generally, if you have dyslexia, you will not look good in spelling. Spelling will just about always tell you the truth. And I see Julie over there nodding her head, and I'm glad. Because right. And here's the deal. Here's the deal. If the child is comprehension impaired, and that's where the difficulty is, you put them in Spire, it's a big fat waste of time. Because yes, it works on comprehension, but to get there, you got to do all this time on decoding, which you can already do. And so that would be like, so you have to look at the profile of the child and match the intervention to that. And we're not generally going to say it's a dyslexia profile if your decoding and your spelling and your sight word accuracy and passage accuracy, if all that is good, we pretty much put you in the category of saying you have a reading issue, but it isn't dyslexia. Does that make sense? So yeah, I would be very concerned about the parents' concerns, and I would find the right way to support that child, but I would not just cave and say, okay, fine, it's dyslexia, because we know what dyslexia is. I'd probably take time to show them why we don't think that it's dyslexia, even going back to that definition. All right, so the PST needs to consider the results and determine the services to be provided for the student. Consider the results and determine. So that is and that's like legally, okay? I didn't put those words up there kind of helter-skelter. That is the real deal. And so if the student fails both the universal screening and, okay, I didn't even start that. See, in Alabama, we have a 2-step screening for dyslexia, and it's beautiful. I've done a whole webinar, national webinar about that. Now other states are jumping on our bandwagon. You start with the universal screening, okay? And that's whatever you do for universal screening, for reading. It could be STAR, it could be Dibbles, it could be AIMSweb, it could be ACE, yeah, it could be Easy CBM. It could be anything that your district's using. I'm trying to think of the soup du jour. Scantron. There it goes. It keeps changing its name, and that's how I lose it. So Scantron, which used to be something else, and my dyslexic brain just wants Globoscope. Thank you. See, and that's hard for my brain. So anyway, so it can be that if that's what you're using. Whatever. No, we don't care what you're using. Who cares? It's what your district uses, what the state wants you to use, what your district wants you to use, whatever. So they fail that universal screening, boom. If they fail the universal screening, how do you fail that? You score below what the district sets for the benchmark. Who sets the benchmark? The district. The district sets the benchmark. So if your district wants to set the benchmark at the 5th percentile, you just won't have many children to serve. You'll just wait and they'll all get in special ed one day. Probably wind up in prison too, who knows. But anyway, drop out. I mean, they'll do it all because that's what happens when we don't support kids. If your district says 25th percentile, which most districts do because that's the bottom of the average range, it's legitimate to say 25th percentile because the average range is 25th to 75th percentile. So that's legitimate. Say 25th percentile. Some districts will say 40th percentile because if you get a child to the 40th percentile, they're not going to slide back into the danger zone. In other words, if you're the 25th percentile, next year you might be at the 10th percentile. Eek! But if you're the 40th percentile, you will not fall below the 25th percentile, and that's pretty solid. That is pretty solid. That's why Renaissance uses 40th percentile as their national benchmark that they recommend to districts. Okay, so if the student fails both the universal screening and the dyslexia screening, so the first part was the whatever we do for universal, and then the next part is those 4 things. If they fail that, then we develop a dyslexia services plan with whatever things we need for that child. Looking at the child individually, looking at the child's environment, like if you're in the 5th grade and you have different teachers every hour or something like that, it's different than if you're in the 1st grade and you're with one person all day, right? So you look at the child and you develop the plan that the child needs. Then, if the student fails the universal screening but passes the dyslexia screening, he still failed the universal screening, right? He still has a problem. So this is that child whoever was asking me about has a comprehension problem, but passes the universal screening, but he failed the universal, he failed the universal, passed dyslexia, still help him, but not necessarily with dyslexia. Okay, you might help him with dyslexia, but it depends on what the child looks like as you are looking at his, all of his characteristics. Okay, whew. I didn't really want to talk about screening, but it occurred to me that if I jumped right in to goal setting and progress monitoring, I was missing a golden opportunity because it's been a while since I talked to large groups about screening, and it's like, okay, to just go ahead and say what we intended when we wrote all that stuff. Yes?
Can I ask one more question before we move on to the screening? Do districts decide when, I heard Mississippi yesterday say they do it January of kindergarten and beginning of first grade. Do districts decide? Because some districts do it in third grade
Well, in Alabama, we didn't say when it has to happen. We just said all children in Alabama schools will be screened for dyslexia. If we find that there's too much wiggle room there, then we may need to go back and tweak that and say all children are screened at the beginning of the school year except for kindergarten, and they're screened in January. Because I don't really want us identifying little 4 or 5-year-olds failing a dyslexia screening when they don't even know what a bathroom is. And I mean, when we bring kids into the school first time ever, I mean, they're not what they're going to look like in 4 or 5 months. So let's just wait and screen kindergarten. And that's what we say in the resource guide. In the resource,
all children, not just a child, all children, right?
Here's what it is. Remember, it's tied to the universal screening. So it's not, you don't screen every child for dyslexia, except you do, because the first step in the dyslexia screening is the universal screening. We screen everybody with that. So if you do Renaissance, let's say you're using star reading as your universal screener, which I wish everybody was, but that's just me. So if you're using star reading and you give it when school starts, and you give it in January, and you give it in May, every one of those is a universal screening that you have done 3 times, and at any point a child that scores below your benchmark could then go on and could have the dyslexia screening. And if you're doing this every year for every child, multiple times a year, then actually we're screening our children for dyslexia 3 times a year because they all took part in the universal screening, and that's step 1. We go to step 2 if they fall below the benchmark. It just says we have a plan if our children score below the benchmark. Yes?
What about students 9 through 12 who only do ACT or ACT work keys or
Yes.
pre-ACT?
So-
Get the results back until.
So one of the books that I wrote was RTI for middle and high school, and it's really one of my favorite books, and it's one that's gotten me invited all over the country because there's not much for middle and high school for exactly what you're saying. And my thought is, and what I've said in that book and everywhere else I've ever talked about it, is once you start getting to middle school and high school, you should use multiple measures for universal screening, not one thing, okay? And so your multiple measures for universal screening for older students would look like the ACT pieces that you're doing. It would look like, it could even factor in grades. It could factor in high school, how many subjects have they failed? How many core subjects have they failed? What about their attendance? I mean, you could have a multifaceted universal screening for academic risk, which good schools have, okay? And it's been out there for a long time. It's not new. And that's how you do the first step. So it's anybody who shows up as on your universal screening for those older kids, which is multifaceted. So you don't do something like, well, we're going to figure out some way to give dibbles to, high school. I mean, that would be insane. So yeah, so it is all those things. And that's the way to do it. And I take a sort of a breath when I say grades, and I wouldn't want to use grades in the elementary for anything because that's not what you want to use for RTI ever in elementary. But once you start getting to middle and high school, a pattern of repeatedly failing subjects, you can't say that is anything like, well, he's had a conflict with a teacher. Yeah, well, okay, well, that might explain this grade, but what about these other 12? And I think attendance has to be part of the screening because we know we have evidence that kids that are going to do the worst are the ones that don't show up. And that ought to be part of your screening. So there are lots of good things. And in that book, I've got lots of links to resources for doing that. Okay. So Alabama's Dyslexia Amendment goal setting. We slipped that into the administrative code. And so it says, and this is the reference in the code, the PST will notify the parents of the results of the dyslexia-specific screening. Ta-da! So you're going to have it, and your parents are going to be told about it. We'll provide parents with a copy of the goals. Oh, really? Well, that means there have to be goals. Of the dyslexia-specific intervention plan, and with data-based documentation regarding the student's progress on a regular basis. Right? We didn't say every 4.5 weeks, which would be sort of like you're on a 9-week grading period and you send out the progress reports. So you do it with a report card and you do it with a progress report. That's really the best way to do it. But we didn't say that. We just said on a regular basis. Because as soon as you start doing that, somebody said, we're on a 6-week grading period, so it would be 3 weeks for us. Please. So anyway, if you just say on a regular basis, and so however you notify parents about grades, you notify them about RTI outcomes. And this is great for dyslexia. In fact, it's legal for dyslexia, but I want you to understand that all of this administrative code stuff comes under the RTI part of the code. So yes, it relates to dyslexia, but it also relates to RTI. So when we put the dyslexia amendments in, we gave teeth to RTI in the state if we want to do it that way. Okay, so that's how that looks. Now we get to the real fun part about goal setting and progress monitoring. But first, we need to think about the data that we have. Because I want you to have enough data when you get ready to set your goals and think about progress monitoring that you're driving the car. In other words, you've said this is what we're going to look at because this makes sense. I already told you, please don't do rate, because that would be a really crummy bit of data to set your goals by and look at progress with, okay? So let's look at what kind of data we might want to access. Oh, and oops, if I can do this right, click again, go back. So you see right here where it says, Rising to Dyslexia Challenges Through Multi-Tiered Systems of Support, a Handbook for Schools, came out in 2017. That's the last book that I wrote. Probably the last book I will ever write. And I'm just saying that in public and getting myself videotaped doing it because I don't want to write any more books. Writing books for a dyslexic person like me is a very scratchy thing for me to do with my spirit. So anyway, that book, though, is honestly, when I wrote the book, it was a labor of love of how to implement Alabama's dyslexia amendments. That's what it's about. And so other states have invited me to come and have now started doing it this way. So that book and this stuff is all in Chapter 5. So Chapter 5 of the Rising to Challenges book, which I love that title, y'all. LRP finally let me name one of the books I wrote for them. Okay, 3 types of data that I want us to think about. One would be what I'm going to call general outcome measure data. How well do you read? Okay? I don't like us to talk about grade level scores, but sometimes we do. I'd rather you say you started out and you were at the 12th percentile, or you started out and you had a scale score of 200, and normal for your grade would be 600. So I would rather it be on some kind of standard score, but you start out and you have your general outcome measure from whatever tool you're using. That could come from Scantron, I believe, gives you a percentile and that kind of stuff as well. And so you start with that data. So we got that kind. And then we have what I'm going to refer to as skill-specific data. Sometimes your general outcome measure is a skill-specific tool. Like if you're using Gibbs or AimsWeb, you're looking at fluency as your general outcome measure. You're measuring how well a child is likely to be reading and where they are in their reading skills based on that indicator, which is fluency. So you're using a skill-specific for your general outcome, which isn't great, but that might be what you're doing. Okay, and so, but we do want to look at skill specific, and so you look at things like their reading accuracy, how they have mastered phonics patterns that would be expected by that grade. What does their fluency look like? What is their comprehension? So those might be some of those indicators, and then their concept mastery data, and this ties directly to your intervention. And y'all, to me, this is one that if you, oh my gosh, I know you're not supposed to touch these boards. These are, that concept mastery data that comes from your intervention, that's the one you cannot live without. You must have that. You can have either one of those, but you must have the data from within the intervention. Okay, we're going to go into all this stuff now. All right, when we're looking for a general outcome measure tool, what is our district using for universal screening? Y'all, we don't have to invent this wheel. I think we should look for tools that have been normed and vetted by outside sources. not just sold to us by a publisher or a bunch of anybody else, but just already been looked at by a reliable source. And the National Intensive Intervention Center Tools Chart is where I want you to go. And you have a link to it here in your handout, and it's in the Google Docs, and I'm just going to take you there briefly. So the NCII, the National Intensive Intervention Center, I'll never get it right, this entity, and let me see if I can make this right. We Mac people, when we have to interface with Windows, don't like the icons. All right, so it looks like this. And so here's AIMSweb Math. This tool has been vetted by the National Intensive Intervention Center, the NIIC. And what this is doing is it's showing you with these circles ones that had ample evidence of validity, of reliability, of having bias analysis. And you can look over here and their growth standards. So if you're using it for progress monitoring, how well does it really monitor and tell you growth that is in a reliable and usable kind of fashion? And how easy is it to use? So they have evaluated these tools. They are not related to the publishers. They don't make a dime off of selling any of these products, which is important, that we look at tools that have been vetted by people who don't make money from the tool. You got it? All right, and so you can slide down here, and just because I am you're seeing, and obviously the bright orange circles, the full orange circles is the best. That's what you want to be. If you're a dash, it means it somehow you didn't provide that information. All right, and so you come up here, and I'm going to take us over to performance. And here we go. There's iSteep and all these different tools. And there's STAR. And you see in terms of reliability and validity, and you see now why Denise would say to you, I wish everybody would use STAR, because it's reliable and valid for all these different things. So anyway, that's the National Intensive Intervention Center. And so we want a universal screener to use, and a progress monitoring tool if we're going to use it that way as well. Because what I'm going to do, if STAR is my universal screener, I'm going to administer it probably every other week as a progress monitoring measure. That's how I'm probably going to do it. So I can use it for both, universal screening, progress monitoring. Okay, baseline level of the student's starting point you'll get from that. That's important to know. Where were you when we started? It's very frustrating to me to go in to a case, and I'll call it a case because if I get called in this, it's usually there's a due process happening and the school's asked me to come in as an expert to review the records and so forth and so on. And I'm looking at data and it shows that the child got an IEP as an LD student for the first time when they were in second grade. Now they're in 8th grade. When they went in, they were, how far do you think you could be behind when you're in second grade? Maybe 2 grade levels below. Now they're 6 grade levels below. So special ed gave you a bigger deficit than you had going in. When that happens, y'all, we are in big trouble. So you have to always keep your eye on what the starting point was. What was the gap? If you're in second grade and you're reading at a kindergarten level, okay, you got a 2-year gap, if we want to say it that way. Got it? Every year you should be narrowing the gap. To narrow a gap in a school year, you must make more than 1 year of gain. Because if you only make 1 year of gain, the gap stayed static. You got it? That's terrible. That's not acceptable. That is not worth being there. That is not worth, the school spending the time with you or you spending your time there, because you are just staying the same. And sadly, a lot of our special ed outcomes across the country, is what birthed RTI actually at a national level, were that kids got in special ed and they didn't get better. They never came out. It was a life sentence. And so, anyway, so you got your gap that you're going to be looking at from this, like, okay, you're 2 years behind or whatever. And so it narrowed because now you're just 1.6 years behind. Now you're just 1.2 years behind. Now you're just 1 year behind. I'm closing in on the gap. But to get that, you understand I have to make more than a year of gain. So when you're sitting there looking at growth data and you see, oh, look, she grew by 6 months this year. What really happened? She fell 6 months further behind. That was not growth at all. And y'all, I have sat at a table with special ed directors, fortunately not in our state, But I have sat at tables with special ed directors who were proclaiming the data to be so good. And I go, but if you really look at it, every year she fell this much further behind. But she has an IEP. And I went, for what? Okay, so is her reading getting any better? Is the gap getting smaller? So that's what you do with that data. So it's necessary to have some general outcome stuff. Now, skill specific. I want you to think about what the child's major challenges are, and you might gather some data about that skill. I think of our dyslexia screening as kind of the skill-specific data. I gathered some skill-specific data with my dyslexia screening. And if I use tools like from within the dyslexia screening to monitor your growth, I might see that your decoding is getting better because now you have more phonics patterns under your belt. Now you can decode nonsense words with greater proficiency. So I can use information from my dyslexia screening as part of that skill-specific data. All right, and this is a book that I've been talking about forever. I keep thinking they're going to come out with a 3rd edition and keep checking. Mine has the covers all torn off, and so I need a new one. I don't want to buy this one if they're fixing to come out with edition 3. It is one of my favorite ever books that I've bought, and I am a true diagnostician. I taught diagnostics at the undergraduate and graduate level at Montevallo. I've done diagnostics all my life. And that's why Scottish Rite honestly got into diagnostics. Because when I went to work for him, I said, we got to start doing testing because I can't live without testing. So anyway, that's how we did 10,000 children, whatever. Okay, but this book, Assessing Reading Multiple Measures, you can get it from Amazon. It's about $50. And it is a spiral-bound book, and almost every page is just an assessment you can copy and use with kids in your school. And you're licensed to do that. So you're not breaking any copyright or anything. And these are some of the ones that I think I use frequently. The phonics screener is one of my favorites. And it has 129 elements in it. And I can tell you at the baseline the child started and could do 12. Usually more, about 20. And then as we go through the intervention, I watch that number climb toward 129. And I'm showing you now growth in phonics patterns with that phonics screener, which can be given multiple times. As long as you don't tell them the answer. I was testing a little boy the other day and he said, well, tell me what the right answer is. I said, I can't do this because when I come back, I will have told you and you'll be cheating. And so he went, you're coming back? I went, maybe. Okay, so anyway, but phoneme deletion, you see all those. So this is a really cool book. And I wish...
I just gave this to all the districts.
Ah, hooray, hooray. That's excellent. That's wonderful. That's wonderful. ARI is such an asset to us. We are so blessed. All right. So now, here is Denise's most passionately favorite data that you may not ever think you're doing a good job with setting goals and progress monitoring if you don't collect this data. In fact, I would say you can't even implement an intervention without this kind of data. And I have started thinking that when I look at interventions, and I'm asked to look at interventions all the time, every time somebody comes out with a new one, Denise, will you review this? And so I can do it quickly because I'll look to see what kind of progress monitoring data is embedded within it. And if it doesn't have good progress monitoring data, I don't want the intervention. Because I need something that comes with guidelines that say, if you're teaching this skill and the child can do this at this percent, move on to the next skill. I need something that's like that. Because without that, do you know what happens with people? They'll start a concept. They'll either stay too long. The kid could have had you move on way long ago, and you're boring them to death. Or you went so fast that now they can't keep up with you. And so you need data that the intervention requires you to collect to be able to move to the next thing. So I look for that data. And y'all have already heard me say that my favorite dyslexia intervention to use in schools, if you're not an academic language therapist, now I want to just make that clear. If you are a certified academic language therapist, I would not even know that you would use this intervention much, but you would certainly guide other people in your system who are also doing dyslexia intervention who don't have your credentials. You would help them use Spire, because Spire can be used with just a very limited amount of training and have awesome results. In Dyer County, which was the first time I ever used Spire, and I was hired, that's in Tennessee, I was hired as a consultant by them for 5 years, and we used Spire, and we turned their schools around. We turned their elementary schools around, and that fed into their high school and their middle school and high school. They're now one of the highest achieving districts in Tennessee, and they were on the other end of the spectrum when we started, I think. And so this is what we learned after using Spire for just a couple of years. And I shared this with the State Department and State Board of Education when we were working on the dyslexia amendments. And that is this. Students who in kindergarten, first or second grade were put in an RTI Tier 3 intervention using Spire as their intervention. And it was done with fidelity, 5 days a week for an hour a day. Students who got that intervention, and this, by the way, was with paraprofessionals delivering it, just so you know, okay? And who I had trained to do the intervention. And I was coming and observing them and giving them feedback and all that stuff. But with these wonderful paras, what we saw was, on an average, about 93% of the children that we served in RTI never required a special ed referral. And we followed those children now all the way through high school, and they still don't need special ed help. So in other words, we took kids, and the only way in Tennessee you could get into a Tier 3 intervention, the only way was you had to be at below the 10th percentile. Not 25th percentile, but below the 10th percentile. So we took the below the 10th percentile kids, served them with Spire and as our RTI intervention, and 93% of them never needed a special ed referral. Now, I would say that without an effective intervention, almost all of those kids would have needed a special ed referral. Would you agree? So guys, it works. And it's not expensive, and it does not require an inordinate amount of training. And it's easy to sustain. And that's why you have heard me talking about Spire now for about the last 7 or 8 years. Because when I saw it work in the field with minimal money and no great resources, had wonderful people. I mean, those paras that I worked with, I would put them against any other human being I've ever worked with. They were all excellent. And they loved it because it was their claim to fame. They were the Spire teacher. And they weren't just there Xeroxing now. This was their teaching. And they loved it. And they never argued with the script. They never said, I don't think I'll do that part. You know, or that's not enough minutes for this. They weren't going to do that. Some reading specialists might take upon themselves to alter it. And so sometimes paras are really a good fit if the intervention is right. Okay, so anyway, in Spire you have this wonderful tool, and you have progress monitoring that you do every day after every lesson, and you don't go to the next concept until you have mastered the existing concept with at least 80% mastery. And this is, in this Spire materials, this is the concept assessment summary form. When I'm asked to consult with districts and we are doing, like where they're sharing their Spire data with a student, maybe there's been an unhappy due process something or other, and they just need another set of eyes to look at it, to be there to back them up that they did it right, and you know, this was what it looked like. What I have found is if the teacher will just send me these for every week that they've done the intervention, I've got a great record of what happened, because this gives you the pre-test for every concept, because I'll put the concept was short E. Okay, it's level 1, which is also, I think, lesson 5. And so the date that we started it was October 15th. Then we do the lesson. This was their percentage. Out of 20 words, out of 10 words embedded in sentences, so 30 opportunities to read the short E words, what percent did they get? So let's just say this kid got 40%. Okay, so 40 was their starting. That was their baseline on that concept. Then we give the intervention. So the first day we did lesson number 5, which was the introduction lesson for short E. So I put 5. Then I put the date, which would be October 15th. And then at the end, I give them this little quick check, which is their exit ticket. And they read 4 words, and they read 2 phrases and 2 sentences, and how did they do? Da-da-da-da. And if they got 80%, I'd probably go, wow, okay, I'm a great teacher. And so then the next day I'm going to come and do 1 reinforcement lesson. That's Denise's rule, okay? 1 reinforcement lesson, da-da-da-da-da-da. And then 80% again. I'll go, okay, dog, let's get done. So I give you the post-test, right? And if you get 80% or better, we can move on to short O or whatever comes next. Do you see how that works? To me, that data gathering is critical to the success of that intervention. And I would go so far as to say other interventions that I've been heavily involved with in my history, because I've been doing this a lot longer than 7 or 8 years, other interventions, the thing that we would always mess up on was it took great judgment on the part of the teacher to be able to know when to move on. If you're an academic language therapist and you've had all this wonderful training and practicum and all that, you probably have cultivated that judgment. Short of that, you might not have. So you need guidance from the materials you're using. So that's Denise's word about that. Okay, so now,
I have a question on that.
yes,
So if you have a group of 3 and one is really struggling. And
yes.
you got somebody who's flying through it and you administer that, do you keep, because you're.
Thank you, Tracy. That I should have said that, but I didn't think about it. Okay, so the question is, what do you do when you're doing a group and everybody's not moving at the same place, the same rate, same pace? Okay, I have 2 different rules. I have a rule for general ed, for RTI, and a rule for special ed. You would know I would, right? Okay, and so the gen ed rule is when the majority of the children are at 80%, you move the group ahead. I know that I went off and left that kid who's not ready, and I call that my straggler, okay? He's not a struggler, he's a straggler, so he's hanging back. All right, so, and it's, what's weird is it's okay to move ahead if you're in a group and they're doing well, and you get, but if you're always the straggler, every skill, pretty soon we're going to know, your data's going to show that it's not working for you, and now I got to make a new choice. I either got to put you in a group, an RTI group that is moving slower. That would be a great solution if you had it, or consider a special ed referral because RTI is not working. Because what I want us to know is when RTI is not working, there's no sin in making a special ed referral. In fact, it's what we're supposed to do. So if it's a gen ed Spire implementation or RTI implementation, I would say when the majority are ready to move the group. If it's a special ed, however, because it's special, you don't move the group until 100% of them are at 80%. So it slows the rate down in special ed, and you will not go off and leave the children. And what my experience has been, my special ed kids are going to need the extra time anyway, and it's just better to use that. So I have 2 rules.
Quick question.
Now you know. Thank you for asking me.
If we are using Spire in our Title I Tier 3 classes, which is general ed,
Uh-huh.
but then special ed is using Spire,
Yeah.
can you do that?
Oh, yeah.
Okay,
Perfect.
Because our special ed director feels that we cannot.
Oh, well, I don't want a conflict with your special ed
I
director,
think there's just
but
a misconception.
here's my thought about it. It's almost funny when I say it sometimes. Okay, so if I am trying to choose an intervention for my Title I Tier 3 intervention, do you think I need to pick an intervention that's not the best that I can find? Right? I mean, I got to pick the one that's the best, right? Now I'm the special ed director, and I got to find an intervention for my special ed kids also. Do you think I should pick an intervention that's not the best I can find? Of course not. So if Spire's it's the best I can find for both worlds. Okay, and I'm not going to tell you, oh, well, Spire's good for gen ed, and then here's this mega intervention for special ed. It isn't like that. So what I have found works beautifully is the implementation in special ed is different. And the rule that Tracy brought out, it got me to remember to say that you have this different rule for moving ahead if it's a special ed. Also, your group size should be smaller. If it's and even Spire says this in the front of the manual. It says, for special ed implementation, group size shouldn't exceed 3. For gen ed, you can go up to 5. So your group size is different. Your pace is different. Okay? And here's the other thing. Spire gives you 3 or 4 different ways that you can implement it with fidelity. One is you can do 30-minute lessons. I hate that because it takes you 2 days to do a lesson, and you're not going to close the gap. You're not going to cover enough levels in a year to make it a good year. So half hour is just pitiful. You can do 45 minutes, and you're still in fidelity, right? And so that 45-minute, when you do that, it'll tell you which steps to skip. If it's an introductory lesson or if it's a reinforcement lesson, it'll say skip step 4, skip step 5, or whatever, depending on what kind of lesson it is. So you got all of it done in 45 minutes, but it's because you left some pieces out. Okay? So some gen ed implementations, where we may have time limits, might be that 45-minute deal, right? Now, and it also says, of course, 60 minutes, which is the gold standard, because now you do the whole thing, you do all of them, and you have time. All right, so special ed would always do the gold standard. Gen ed might have to flex and do a 45-minute and collapse it. You see what I'm saying? So I think you can definitely use it for both, but you customize it depending on your population. And if I knew a better intervention, I would be recommending it, but I wouldn't save it for special ed. I would share it with the world.
Well, that's my view, to do it that way, because
Yeah.
I think we're causing a lot of cognitive confusion with our children when they've been taught one method and then you go into either 2 or 3
Yeah.
special ed and
Yeah.
they're being taught different.
Well, and even just things like keywords. How cool is it that if I was in Gen Ed, RTI, and I was learning, that this bed is the one for okay, and then when I get into special ed, it's still bed is the keyword for So it's just cool.
It feels like to me that when you said that, even if you have multiple programs, it's almost like the school probably needs to come up with which deck of keyword cards are you going to use? Something
Yes.
I know what the program says, but
Yep. Yep.
Connect Ed uses something
Yeah.
different than Inspire.
Yeah.
Is there-
Yes, and what I think too is, and I've had real happy implementations in schools where I've been able to get the Gen Ed teachers who are teaching Tier 1 and Tier 2, because usually I've got Gen Ed teachers teaching Tier 2. This, like, my second grade class, I get to teach my Tier 2 kids, so that usually happens. And so go ahead and give them the Spire keywords so that they're doing that as part of Tier 2 as well, and that can also be facilitative. And it also then, when my Spire babies come back into the classroom, they speak the same language, and that's just excellent. So all that is about communication, isn't it? And just good common sense. Yes. All right. So now, we need to reflect on our intervention destination. Now we're finally to goal setting. We were at progress monitoring and what kind of data, and now we're going to set goals. And you got to think, where do I want to get you? And this is the hardest slide in the whole deck. Okay? When I get finished with this, you should have a master's degree in goal setting. I will award it to you as you exit this afternoon. It'll look like a certificate for code read. Okay, so anyway, but tell everybody you got a master's degree in goal setting. Okay, so this could be, you want your students to move into the average range. You want to get them to at least the 25th percentile, okay? Then it might be that you want to achieve whatever your district set as the benchmark. Maybe your district set 40th percentile. That might be your goal. It might be that you want them to have some level of proficiency to pass the test. When we were doing ACT Aspire, okay, and I'm frankly kind of glad we're not anymore, I did because our data in some districts just looked so scary, and I thought, well, we didn't just suddenly forget how to read. What's going on? Well, the level of proficiency that you needed, and I'm not going to say this exactly right, but I have the data, but I haven't looked at it in a while because it finally went away. But to be proficient to be ready on the ACT Aspire, you had to read, say, as a 4th grader, you had to read at the 65th percentile on STAR. Because STAR can tell you that for every assessment that there is. So you had to be 65th percentile. Really? So I was sitting in a goal setting meeting, and I had an administrator say to me, we're setting all of our RTI goals for 65th percentile for this grade, because that's what you have to be proficient on the ACT. And that's what we're measured by. And I just went, whoa. And as a consultant, you have to kind of be nice and not just say, well, that's the dumbest thing I ever heard. That's not going to work. You don't say that. They won't invite you back. And when you're representing Scottish Rite, that lady from Scottish Rite told us we were dumb. I've never told anybody that. So here's what I think I said. Something like, well, I get why you want to do that, and STAR has a report that will let you do that. It's called Pathway to Proficiency, and we can certainly run those, but I don't know that it has to guide our RTI goals, but if you want it to, I said, but I would just say, if we're going to set the goals, by the way, then my favorite thing about using STAR is like showing the kids their graph and how they're approaching their goal and exceeding their goal and all that. I said, just don't do that. Just don't show them their goal, because they'll be too sad. And you don't want to be smacking the child once they're doing that. Okay? So he changed his tune. He said, oh, I didn't think about it like that. I said, yeah, it's like, what are we going to do with this data? Okay, so you got another report that'll tell you if they're going to pass the test. That doesn't have to be the RTI goal. All right, then demonstrate growth that is at least as much as expected, or maybe even more, and that comes from something called student growth percentile. This is the single best metric that exists in the universe for setting goals for children in terms of growth in academic skills. Student growth percentile. And we need to wonder if we're closing the gap. All right, so I just want to show you. All right, so I'm going to just show you how to set a goal, and we're going to look at, for a general outcome measure, we're going to look, of course, at STAR. And we can use this general outcome measure, as I said earlier, to obtain our baseline, to consider the district's destination, where do we want to get our kids to, and to then set the goal and determine the weekly rate of improvement. Because if you have not determined weekly rate of improvement, for your students in RTI, you cannot know if RTI is working. You cannot know that. You must set a ROI, rate of improvement. So I want to show you that with the STAR goal setting wizard, and we'll see how it incorporates. Now, I'm not going to come back to this slide most likely, but you see I've written a goal for you there. So it says Stephen will achieve an average weekly rate of improvement of 4.9 scale score points per week, reflecting growth in reading proficiency as measured by STAR reading. Okay? So there's the goal that I would be done sharing with the parent, right? That's the goal of the thing from the general outcome measure. And so, let's see. Okay. I hope you can sort of see that. I could expand it if I was on my Mac. But anyway, so this is the goal setting wizard and it from STAR. And what it does is it gives you a place to put the name of the intervention you're going to put the student in. It gives you when you're going to end intervention, the end of the intervention period. And usually it's the end of the school year because you don't want to have to keep going back and setting goals every 6 weeks. And then you've got the starting test that you're using. And STAR will let you click this if there have been multiple tests. And then you get to pick the goal. And so a moderate goal would be to grow at a student growth percentile of 50. Now, I want to tell you what student growth percentile is. STAR has had a way to take millions probably now, but at least hundreds of thousands of test scores of children and to look at children who started and they were at the 20th percentile. What growth did they make across the country? And 50% of all children who started at the 20th percentile grew by the SGP of 50. So that means you grew about average for where your starting point was. It's important to look at where your starting point was when you look at growth. You might think that low kids, right, have worse growth than high kids. That's not true. High kids have the worst growth because they ain't got that much room to improve, right? So what you want to know is, so you're a 20th percentile kid, what kind of growth can we expect from a 20th percentile kid? You're a 40th percentile kid, what kind of growth do we expect from a 40th percentile kid? So SGP factors all that in. And it is an extremely complex math equation that does that, and they use data that continues to accumulate. So it's a moving thing as more and more kids take the test from that level and show growth as they move through the year. Because remember, people take the STAR test 3 times a year. So they look at that growth from point A to point B to point C. It's amazing what that data shows you about what is an amount of growth that is reasonable. So they've got it as moderately ambitious, which is 66 SGP. That means you did better than 66% of all children who started out where you did. So you see, you're like now above average. If you didn't get at least 50, your growth is below average. Do you get it? And look down here. You've got these weirdo numbers like catch up and keep up and all that. That's calculated on your state test. And that'll be different depending on what your state test is. Okay? And we don't use that much because we keep changing our tests, and so we don't know. It's okay, though. I'm glad we changed the test. That was good thinking. Okay, so anyway, now we got this cool one that is my favorite of all, which is I got a custom goal. All right? So if my district says we want to get all of our children to the 35th percentile, okay? I can just click custom, click percentile, because I could have picked scale score also. But pick percentile and then put 35 in, and it says, well, that's 5.4 scale score points per week, compared to 4.9, which was moderately ambitious. So do you see? So if I have that principal who wants to say, I want to get everybody to the 65th percentile, then this would say something like 12. And I would say, well, 66%, you'd be doing better than 66% if you just grew by 4. So, okay. Nobody grew that much in that whole area. So you see how that works? So I think SGP is way cool. And it, to me, makes such sense when we're setting goals that we use...
monitoring with the STAR to see if they made that growth?
Yeah. Yeah. And you only get SGP growth calculated from fall to winter and then from winter to spring, not from week to week.
Not so they would be waiting. You're saying they need to grow 5 points, but it would be at the winter benchmark.
Correct. So what it would be is 5, if you had 10 weeks between now and the winter benchmark, it would be 10 times the, right, that's how that is. Okay, and that's basically how ROI works in general. Okay,
That STAR progress monitoring, that's not within the test, or is that,
yeah,
so they log in and take it just like they would the other things, but it's
Yep.
gonna count on whatever date you set for the fall and the.
that's right.
benchmark.
Yes,
Okay.
yeah. And you can take STAR as often as once a week, but I like to do it about every other week for progress monitoring with STAR. And I've been in districts that use that, and it was a great way for us to take a big look at our RTI outcomes and a focused in look on our RTI outcomes.
If you give them the accommodation of extended time, when that gets up
Yeah, you will. And I would give this accommodation of extended time for kids with IEPs, but probably not for RTI kids, because you don't want to inflate the growth of your RTI kids by making them look better on an assessment. Do you see what I'm saying? But if you've written in extended time in an IEP, okay, then you should have extended time. And what you know now is you can look at growth for yourself. That extended time doesn't mess up the fact that you grew by 20 scale score points, because you had extended time both times, right? But what it doesn't let you do is compare you to the other kids across the country and know what your SGP is, because they didn't get extended time. And as far as I know, they don't have a way for us to put SGP for extended time. But it's still, with IEP kids, extended time is good.
the 504, if you have diagnosis of dyslexia, and 504.
As long as SGP is not one of those things you're hanging on. I mean, it's fine. I mean, you're still seeing growth. You just won't know if it's SGP growth or not. But you could do it that way, and the growth could be like astronomical. Who knows? So I would just say, if they need the extended time and you've written that into their plan, 504 or IEP, or even dyslexia plan, then don't feel bad about that. But just know you can't do the SGP. All right. So moving ahead, let me see what the time is. We're still okay. We have 14 more minutes. Okay. So we're going to analyze our progress monitoring data regularly. And I'm going to just say maybe monthly. Your team will sit down and look at the data together. And this is where we kind of sometimes drop the ball. Okay, thank you. We sometimes drop the ball when we're looking at progress monitoring data. So you're going to look at whichever data you want to look at, all of them, some of them. Maybe this month we look at this one more. We don't really have a STAR to talk about yet, so we're not going to look at it. And we might wait and talk about it in January or whatever. And so I have a form that's in the Dyslexia Resource Guide. It's also in every book I've written. And this is called the SIPAD form, the Student Intervention Plan and Documentation Form. It's your one-page documentation of RTI. I'm serious. This is the Walmart form of RTI documentation, because on this form you've got everything you need for identification. You've got the starting point, you've got the goal, the rate of improvement, you've got this in the Google Drive to just even print. And you've got all this good stuff. And then on this same form, you've got attendance and intervention. You've got the weekly progress monitoring, if you're doing it weekly. If you weren't, you just see it there and there, if you're doing it every other week. You've got growth rate, which if you're using STAR, it will calculate that for you, but not till you have 4 data points. Okay? And then you've got when the team met and what they said to do. Continue the intervention and what they said to the parent. You're supposed to document the progress to the parent, and there it is, and that's the date you did it on. So one page, you have every requirement of RTI from the federal level of what RTI is supposed to look like. And it also lines up perfectly with our Dyslexia Resource Guide and our administrative code. So that's the SIPAD form. And again, that mentalness in me, really, if you have a dyslexic person doing your paperwork for you, it's not a bad thing, because she is going to try to figure out a way where you have to do less reading and less writing. Just saying. Okay, now, here we go. We're almost done. All right, consider the changes that you need to do. If the growth is not what you planned, because this is the part where we also can drop the ball. We meet, we look at the data, we say, oh, dog, that's terrible, isn't it? Okay, we'll see you next month. Okay, so you're going to, if the growth is not what you want, what you needed, if the ROI is not 4.3 when it needed to be 4.3, or you haven't improved your accuracy, because you can do this for accuracy, and I skipped the slide where I give you a tool for doing ROI by hand, and also by, I don't know how I skipped it, but an ROI with a calculator with a spreadsheet that I shared with you. It's in your handout though. But anyway, so you're going to determine if the growth wasn't what it needed to be. Are we doing the intervention right? What's our fidelity? Like, okay, well, we said we were going to do this 5 days a week, but when you look at that attendance thing from that SciPad form, it says the teacher was out 60% of the time. That happens. That does happen to some people for whatever reason, you know? Or the child was out 60% of the time. So if the child's absent, that's a problem. That's why I think when we look at our data, we've got to be looking at attendance simultaneously. Because the first thing you say when you look at that data sheet in a meeting is, and the growth's not what you want, well, were they here? And it's right there staring you in the face. Okay, then you're going to compare that student's growth to the other kids in the group. So if everybody else in the group is growing, and this kid is an outlier, well, it's not, we're not going to blame it on the fact that we're not doing the intervention right, because this not just maybe not working for this kid. Then you're going to consider adjusting the intervention maybe. Might you think about a smaller group? Might you think about more intensive schedule? If you got the kid in a Aspire group and you got 8 kids in it, because that's what you thought you had to do, and the kid's not growing, maybe you need to figure out a way that you can put him in a group with 5. Maybe nobody's growing, and maybe you got to figure out a way, because that goes back to the fidelity, doesn't it? All right, then so then you might even think about a different intervention. You might even consider about making a referral to special ed if we've been doing this for a while. And then the main thing is don't do nothing. If growth is not what you want, don't do nothing because it's in red. That means you probably figured this out. Denise really wants you to get that. Is educational malpractice to keep students in an ineffective intervention for years. RTI should not be a life sentence. Y'all, this is a true story. Good friend, she's on the Dyslexia Advisory Council. I'm sitting in a meeting with her at the State Department of Education. She says, and this is the first time I've heard her say this, and it just about made me fall out of my chair. She found out after she had been talking about thinking her child had dyslexia and needed help for her child. My child's not growing. I need help. She had been doing this for years. The school said to her, he has been in RTI for the last 4 years. She said, how am I supposed to know that? And if he is, it's not working because he still can't read. And the school said, oh, he's been doing good in RTI. No data shared with parents. No informing the parents the child was in RTI. And the child had been in it for 4 years. No special ed referral. And the kid can't read. Now, guys, that is malpractice. Just saying. Okay? It's what made me think, we got to do better. We got to do better. Okay. Now, so then, after we've had our meeting and we've looked at our data and we've gotten some ideas of what to do, what we want to do then is send a progress report to the parents. And I would say not less than monthly or not less than as often as you send out report cards or grades. You know, the progress report and the report card. And then you're going to inform the parents about the student's rate of improvement. When it said data-based reports, that's what this means. You're not going to say, he's doing well, ta-da. You're going to say something like this. Mary's goal rate of improvement is 2.7, and her achieved rate of improvement is 4.9 for data collected from 9:15 through 10:2. So do you see how that's going to feel? So the parent says, and you've had a meeting with the parent so they know what rate of improvement is, and you know, this is what you want to have, this is what you got, hey, we're on a roll. That kind of data empowers us and it empowers parents. And it lets us know, keep this intervention going at all costs because it's working. Or, oh my gosh, the goal rate of improvement was 2.7 and the actual or achieved rate of improvement is 0.06. I've seen those, 0.06. 0.06 will never be an acceptable goal rate, achieved rate. Then, if you're wanting to write the data back to the parent based on SPIRE data or your intervention-specific data, you might say, Mary completed SPIRE Level 3 lessons 1, 1A, 1B, 2, 2A, 2B, 2C, 2D, blah, 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 with an average mastery, see how I'm collapsing it, of 92% based on daily quick checks from September 5th through October 2nd. So do you see how now I've turned my SPIRE intervention-specific data into a great progress database progress report to parents? It's easy, and it's right there for you. You just have to do it. And then the last one, you will make an overall comment, most likely, to say, Mary is making excellent progress, or is making some progress, or making limited progress, or whatever, making minimal progress, and we are considering changing the intervention, and we'll be trying X, Y, or Z, in the coming days. Okay, so These are the two recorded webinars that I've done for Renaissance Learning. The first one talks about our two-step screening, just like I talked about today. And that's what that is. And these are free. You just click that link and you can go and watch the webinar. This one's 60 minutes. This one's 60 minutes. This one I did last week. This one I did last year. And you can see that this one was basically what we talked about today, except I didn't talk about screening. Okay? So those are I'm just sharing those with you. It is just thank you for being here, and here's my book. If you would like to buy it, the Gibbs children will be very happy that you are supporting their mom's book.